She found the horse before the sun did, before the soldiers stirring in the lower camp could complain about weather or rations, before the valley woke and filled itself with the long familiar sounds of men speaking too loudly to hide their fear. Mara had been walking the ridge for hours, her boots ground to the same rhythm by habit, eyes tuned to the landscape the way a smith's hand felt for a fault in iron. Her back still ached in ways the morning air could not fix, and the bitterness in her mouth had nothing to do with cold coffee. The war had given her many things: scars, instincts, an appetite for silence, and it had taken from her the luxury of surprise. So when the horse appeared, enormous and still, tethered to a twisted oak that leaned over the road like a leaning captain, she stopped with a seasoned sort of disbelief. The mane was knotted with leaves, and the note, fluttering like a small, disobedient flag, was stuck in the hair by a loop of leather. She squinted. The horse was wrong in all the ways that made a person breathe differently. It stood a head and chest above the cart horses the grooms had kept to the palace, its barrel as wide as a door, its legs thick as broken columns. Its coat was not simply black or bay. It was the color of wet storm and old coal, seeming to drink what little light there was and give nothing back. Where a normal horse bore the simple wear of harnesses and hay, this one bore a history. The edges of its ears were nicked, the hooves were scarred with old iron, and the saddle marks blanketed its flank like bruises, as if someone had ridden across continents on its back. In its eye, a round, dark planet, there was no fear. There was only the patient weight of something that had watched more than it had done. She had been a soldier long enough to know when fate threw a thing into her path like a gauntlet. She moved closer, boots sinking in frost-hardened grass, and the horse flicked its tail without looking. Up close, it smelled like rain on hot stone and something else, steel or old smoke, an odor that set a fight-or-flight reflex to dull, manageable. The knot of leather in its mane was frayed from too much handling. The note was folded with care and fastened by a strip of vellum. Ink, black as the horse's flank, had bled slightly where the weather had touched it. She tugged it free with 2 fingers. The script was a deliberate, leaning hand like the kind you learned in the old academies and never unlearned. Lines were precise. There was a stamp in faded red wax at the corner of the paper that she did not recognize. There was a single sentence, one sentence, carved and blunt as a blade. Do not free this beast unless you know the cost of letting giants walk loose among men. She felt the words like a cold breath against her spine. The note could have been a jest, a trap, an invitation, a curse. All of those were possible in a country that had taught her to expect nothing else. Mara folded the paper back into her pocket with the same slow precision she had used to count rations and check for flaws in metal. Then she reached out with the steadiness of a veteran and touched the horse's neck. The hair came away like water from polished iron. The animal exhaled against her palm, and the breath smelled like the old ocean in the inside of a forge. There was a harness loop around its chest, worn soft by hands that had once been firm. Tied to the loop was a strip of blue cloth. The cloth was filthy, more lived in than the camp banners in any capital, and when Mara unwrapped it she found a crest blackened with soot, a pair of crossed spears beneath a crown. That crest belonged to the House of Orin, the house that had raised generals and claimed glory for a century, the house she had fought against and with in uneven measures. Her fingers remembered the feel of that emblem on a uniform, the pride it had once given men, the way it had swallowed their faces. A laugh rose in the distance, a harsh sound like stone scraping stone. Mara looked up. 2 riders had crested the ridge, 2 silhouettes against the pale morning, armored and laughing at the cheap jokes of men who lived too close to the hearth and not close enough to danger. They were the sort of men who wore their teeth in silver and kept opinions like currency. One of them, broader than the other and flushed with a swaggering authority, hailed her with a voice that never bothered to hide that it expected consent. "You lost, girl," the broader rider called. His words were soaked in condescension. "This part of the road is for riders and nobles. Tie your broom to something else." Mara did not answer. That had become a habit of hers. not to answer until she had weighed the cost of words. Her silence was a shield and a blade. The riders drew nearer, their boots slapping the earth, the jingling of metal steady and contemptuous. The smaller of the two looked more curious than cruel. He rode the kind of horse bred to nervous perfection, sleek and narrow, its flank glistening like a coin. He studied Mara the way someone might study a wound to assess how deeply it ran. "You a beggar, then?" he asked. "A girl walking a great lord's roan through the countryside?" The stories grow stranger every season. His laugh invited accompaniment. Two other riders, coming up at a trot from the back, heard it and added their own rough voices, a chorus in the key of mockery. Mara shifted her weight against the horse's neck. The animal did not react to the insults. It had the composure of something used to being the object of attention, and the attention, Mara realized crisply, was not always welcome. She had seen that look before in men who were pushed aside and still remembered their place. Her life had been built of places in and out of which people insisted upon stepping. She recognized, suddenly, the worn leather strap at the horse's flank as something more than a tangle. It was a symbol, like the crest, of other people's assumptions about what belonged to whom and why. A rider named Haver, he had the thin nose of someone who had eaten nothing but later days and vows, pointed to the blue cloth and smirked. "Looks like someone abandoned their Orin gift," he said. "Must be cursed to have a horse that size and no master." "Huh. We'll tell the captain it weighed in as evidence of their extravagance." "You'd better let it be," Mara said, her voice low as gravel and twice as steady. It startled none of them, because no one expected an answer she had not authorized. Her words were factual. They had been the things she used to shut down arguments at cold dawns or to instruct a squad in a ruin. A horse tied to a tree draws trouble. They laughed then, a sharper sound, a coal bell. "Do you hear that?" Haver said, loud enough for the others. "She talks like she's one of them. Fancy hair, MM. Did you ride with the Phantom Legion, girl?" He baited her with a name that had passed like smoke through command tents. The Phantom Legion, whispered because they had done things that made ordinary men remember the taste of fear. Mara's jaw tightened. The mention of the Legion was a rock dropped into a pond full of whispers. Mara kept her face blank. There were things about her past she had shelved like detritus, a trunk of medals and faded orders buried under a floorboard. Her time with the Phantom Legion had been something she never told stories about, because stories made men think they owned ghosts. But ghosts had a habit of answering when they saw a certain pull. The horse's presence felt like such an answer. The animal shivered at a sound only it seemed to hear and fixed its gaze on the valley below, as if it could see something stitching the sky to the world. "You two ought to be careful," she said. "It isn't safe here. Bandits use these trees." "Bandits?" Haver snorted and spat. "We're the ones who make safety, girl. We'll chase them off. Besides, what good is a horse with no master?" Then he dismounted with the careless arrogance of a man who intended to make a spectacle. He walked up, boots crunching the frozen grass, and circled the animal as if performing an anatomy exam. His hand went to the horse's shoulder and hovered, then landed, a touch that claimed. The horse did not flinch, but the air around them seemed to color differently. Mara felt something in her chest tighten, like the memory of a wound resuming pain. The animal's muscles, beneath the coarse coat, were like rippled steel. When Haver grinned, white and certain, Mara stepped forward. She did not push him away. She did not draw a blade. She moved like someone who had measured the criteria for escalation and found them insufficient. She reached out and rested her palm on the horse's neck, between where Haver's hand and the animal met. The touch was a small, deliberate assertion. She belonged there, too, if only because she had been at the same place where things happened that mattered. The horse turned its head toward her and breathed in long and slow, as if savoring a name. For a fraction of a second, every sound in the world grew thin. The rider's laughter wavered. Hava looked at Mara with a new expression crawling through his features. Confusion, shock, then something like doubt. The smaller rider, whose name Mara learned later was Crispin, cocked his head the way a dog might when it puzzled over a stranger's smell. "You can touch it," Mara said, fair and quiet. It will not bite. It will not run away. The words were simple fact. She had not spoken to cowards in years, and the men in front of her did not qualify as anything more than noisy things in armor. Their arrogance was not innate. It had been taught by being allowed to say it. Haver's face broke into a grin that tried to recover the morning. Well then, why don't you take the reins and show us what you're made of, soldier? His tone was mocking, but the phrase held a key. It had been the phrase used to distinguish those who had earned the right to command. Mara felt in every sinew a memory of orders barked across the cold and the weight of a lifetime of doing hard things without speech. She looked at Haver and saw, with a clarity she had avoided, that his competency had never been the answer to anything. He was a man who wore authority like a cloak bought too large. The smaller man dismounted as well, brushing dust from his sleeves like he meant to prove he would not soil himself. Tell me, Phantom, did you ride deserts or politics? Crispin asked, eyes glittering with the thin cruelty of the comfortable. We cannot have legends hanging about these roads. The common folk get ideas. A woman's voice from beyond the ridge called a name. The captain had a way of calling things that made silence obey. And here the voice was necessary because the day was growing loud with petty jokes. She would come with judgment, Mara assumed, and with the authority that ate lesser men's barbs like a scythe through straw. But it was not the captain who crossed them. It was an old man, a district magistrate whose authority was measured in papers and the courtesy of men who avoided being burned by his pen. Leave her be, he said, limping forward, and his voice carried weight like a hammer. Old roads teach wisdom to young feet. He squinted at the horse, then at Mara. His eyes were the color of written pages, faded but precise. He had the air of someone who had made a career of measuring debts and always knowing which side owed more. You speak too kindly for a magistrate, Haver sneered. This one could be trouble, could be hiding thieves in her sleeves. You would make a poor judge, the magistrate said. A judge must honor what is found. Do not be the sort who rights wrongs by laughter. His hand moved as if he had once liked the feel of ceremony. We will send word to the stable master. The horse will be held. No one may claim it without due process. Haver's jaw tightened. He was not a man who liked the sound of process. He liked action that bared his teeth. The idea of waiting for a stable master, waiting, was unbearable. And who will wait? He demanded. Not I. I have things to do. The magistrate's face hardened with the knowledge of authority. We will leave it until the court decides. That is the law. He jabbed a list of his own legalities at Haver with a voice that did not indulge. Then he turned to Mara and for the first time spoke soft, as if setting a tea time for a dangerous animal. You should go then, he said. This is not a safe place for one woman alone. Mara said nothing. She tied the blue cloth back into the loop of the harness and moved to stand between the horse and the magistrate, as if she were a pivot. There was a hunger in her to keep the horse from being taken for reasons she could not name aloud. For a reason she might have mistaken, in less sober moments, for possessiveness. She thought of the Phantom Legion's old motto, duty above self, and let that stand for something that needed reverence, even in the absence of ceremony. Days simmered into a week. The horse remained tethered to the oak. Word traveled faster than a courier with a good horse, and people came to gawk at the beast. Hands reached to touch its flank. Laughter and betting followed suit. The magistrate posted a notice promising that an inquiry would be held. Haver and his friends came twice more to try to take advantage, and found the law was not a ladder they could climb without patience. The spectacle fed itself into the valley's mosaic of stories. Some said the horse was a spirit. Some said it had been a stallion of a lord who had fled with shame. Camp followers speculated. Children made wildly improbable games about giants and the stable master, an unremarkable man with the quiet dignity of men who served, kept an official record that smelled of ink and authority. It was not pleasant watching men speculate about a thing meant for silence. People traded their jokes like fish, and laughter is an ember that can set entire woods' worth of assumptions alight. Mara spent her nights near the oak, wrapped in her coat, and the horse came like a companion should. She would lay her head against its flank, and she would listen to the valley breathe. The animal's heartbeat was even and enormous, like a drum you felt through the ground. Sometimes she would rise and walk the perimeter, a patrol woman of a lonesome peace. The ridicule did not stop. A coterie formed like mold. People who saw in a horse a chance to be clever made it their business to mock what they did not understand. They crafted songs that included her name in dubious verses, and someone, silk-mouthed and cruel, started calling her the Maid of the Hollow because she walked alone and bore a worn bridle that the camp followers said belonged to a housemaid rather than a soldier. The name was a knife, and it worked, cutting at her shoulders until she stood taller and the cuts turned into another sort of armor. One afternoon, as the wind whistled low and thin, someone, one of Haver's faction, came and scattered a handful of Mara's custom ammunition across the lane. Mara had kept a small pouch of cartridges, carefully crafted and tailored for a rifle the army had once issued to legionnaires of her kind. The bullets were balanced, wound in talc, like a person preparing a report before a general. They had been a part of her that only the rifle took. Their absence was an insult precisely because they were not everyday objects. She found them in the mud, brass dull beneath dirt, and the act curdled something in her. Another night, someone announced to the camp that her bridle was a hazard, a cause for contempt because it had belonged to a princess, not a common soldier. They meant to strip her of a symbolic proximity to power, to paint her as a fraud. The magistrate, who had never liked being drawn into drama, wrote a formal notice that her belongings would be held until some invoice could be produced. The hands that had once pinned medals to her chest now pushed papers in front of her like a door. It was petty and it stung. The coterie of mockers, Haver, Crispin, their friends, and the murmuring apprentices in the kitchens, had discovered a delight in orchestrating humiliation. Their laughter had become a performance designed to show who counted and who did not. They had turned her quiet into a blank space upon which to project communal scorn. They misread the blankness. They misread everything that did not shout back. One late evening, under a sky that was a thin bruise between black and blue, the magistrate summoned her to the tent used for inquiries. He sat behind a table that smelled of smoke and ink, his hands folded around a paper that he pointed like a stake. He had the look of a man who always preferred the friction of words to the heat of decisions. Today his face had the settled weariness of a man who had argued with far worse. "You are well known in the district," he said, cutting across the prelude of perfunctory greetings. "Your war record is on file. There are rumors that you claim heritage with House Oren, that you rode with the Phantom Legion. We have men who say your bridle belonged to one of the nobles." He traced a circle with a pen until the ink bled. "We have to be careful, Miss Mara. The law stands between claim and theft." She sat across from him with the same stillness as a sealed tomb. The tent smelled like dried herbs. Her hands were folded in her lap. She let the magistrate speak until the instruments of legal caution had been spent, and then said, plainly, he left it to his daughter. The magistrate blinked, a man clutching at an argument that had thought itself clever. His daughter, he asked. Which daughter? House Oren would know. He left it to his daughter, Mara said again, and the words hung like a folded blade. She had been asked to explain many things in the 3 years since the war had taken titles and given back rubble. She did not have the patience for lies. She gave it to the horse. He gave me the saddle because I found them at the same time. Phantoms do not simply hand out gifts in a ditch, the magistrate said, more to the air than to her. He could feel his case fraying. It seems likely the horse and the bridle were abandoned for a reason. Possibly they were used in some theft or worse. Mara met his eyes and said in a voice that had been given authority by hardship, not by ceremony, "You are paid to find the truth. You have the time. You will when you choose to look." She left his tent with the same slow shelf of dignity she had learned in ranks. You did not run when someone called you guilty. You presented yourself to the named offense and let the world find its balance. The magistrate, who liked the sound of cases being neat, recorded her words and promised action in his slow way. He did not know she had already decided. Decision for Mara was never a sudden lightning-struck thing. It was a brick wall built over weeks, a series of small choices made again and again until the larger insistence could not be ignored. The final provocation came on a morning painted with frost. Haver and his friends had organized a display, a public joke meant to humiliate her thoroughly. They had stolen the bridle. No, they had taken a worn strap and tossed it into the mud and then stood over it with the arrogance of boys who thought they were men. The magistrate advised caution, and the crowd gathered, as townspeople love a thing that promises a theatrical collapse. The coterie of mockers had even concocted a wager, whether the Maid of the Hollow, her unfortunate new name, would be reduced to pleading in the street for the bridle like a beggar. Mara came to the square because she had to. She did not come with plans to make speeches or to clap them down with words. She came to do something that did not need to be justified afterward, because justification was a poor cousin to truth. She found the strap in mud, looked at it with hands that remembered fixing harnesses in rain, and then, without ceremony, untied the horse. The crowd expected theatrics. She gave them something far subtler, a small, deliberate action. "You cannot hold what belongs to history by sticking in the damp," she said. The voice was quiet, barely carrying. It cut because it was plain. "Tie the bridle back on if you like, but do not make a sport of making people small." Haver's face turned the color of iron. He had been building that morning's humiliation like scaffolding, and someone had come and taken his scaffolding down on purpose. He lunged for the strap, but the horse moved like the world itself had shifted. It dipped its massive head and shook, and Haver's hand slipped in the mud. The crowd gasped, an animal sound that changed the atmosphere from a rehearsal of cruelty to surprise edged with fear. Haver found his footing, stalked forward, and raised his voice so the square knew he was the affronted party. "This is mine to decide," he declared. "I will not be told to respect the wishes of a girl who comes from a ditch." Mara looked at him. There was a history in her that formed into a line and passed through those eyes. She took out the note from her pocket and held it up. "Someone left an order," she said, and the words that followed were as simple as the ink on paper. "Do not free this beast unless you know the cost of letting giants walk loose among men." She let the sentence hang, so the crowd would have to swallow it. Haver sneered and called the order cowardly and pitiful, and every mocking thing men can be when they are anxious. The magistrate, who had worn his threadbare wisdom until he could not, stepped forward and read the note himself. He read it twice. The reading did little to comfort Haver's pride. The coterie's jeers rose like mice in a wall, all desperate sounds. Someone threw a rotten apple, and though it missed, the action suggested escalation. Haver, faced with the fact that the law had once again restrained him and that his theme of ridicule paled under the weight of a piece of paper, lashed out not with words, but with a petty but painful act. He took 2 of Mara's custom rounds, the ones found in the mud a week before, and smashed them underfoot. The brass shuddered, and the sound was a broken whisper as metal gave way. That act, more than any word, became the catalyst. The crowd shifted. There was a heat in the air, as if someone had bared a gravestone and asked people to judge. Mara did not move forward or shout. She lifted her hand, and the horse bowed, as if in recognition. The animal's breath brushed the palm of her hand, and something passed between them. No one could say what, and whatever was exchanged was not for public witness. The horse's flank rose and fell slow as a tide. Then Mara did something that stunned everyone because they had not expected the stoic to respond in a spectacle at all. She climbed onto the animal's flank with a motion so quiet that the first murmur among the crowd was whether they had imagined it. Her boots hit the horse's side and found a cradle, a place worn by countless riders. There was no fancy saddle for her. It was a simple landing, one she had performed in more dangerous places. She raised her hand. The town fell into silence, not because the law held it, but because the horse's presence compelled it. It was as though some ancient rule had been remembered. When a thing like that moved, men deferred. Mara looked at Haver and Crispin, and at the magistrate, and at the crowd, and for a moment the memory of a lifetime of orders made itself a single steady thing in her chest. "If you wish to challenge me," she said, her voice stripped of warmth, "do so with facts not with the cruelty of sport. Haver, who relied on sound and number to feel like a man, did not answer with facts. He answered with a challenge of a different sort. He drew his sword, a stubby weapon with the shine of one kept for show rather than use. The crowd gasped with the kind of eager horror that feeds on spectacles and promised to be a hungry thing. The magistrate moved when he ought not to, his papers scattering like leaves. Other men fell in where they did not belong. In the middle of it, Mara sat as if she had been sculpted to provide stability. The first blow did not matter, for it did not reach her. The horse's response was instantaneous and beyond the understanding of men who measured the world in iron. Where Haver had expected a bit of spirit and a kick, the horse turned, planting its foreleg back and forward in a motion that set the ground to hum. The sound it made was not a neigh, but a noise deeper, like the air lifting off the sea. The sword clattered from Haver's hand, as if metal remembered a different order of things and chose not to remain where it had been. Men fell backward. Their surprise had the shape of a ruined expectation. The horse moved then, not with the aim to harm, but with an economy that stunned into reverence. The air thickened. Every breath felt weighted. A gust of wind rose from the valley like the exhale of a beast waking and swept through the square, whipping hair and coin and the accents of men's voicings into one, as if rewriting language. The magistrate's papers rose and skittered like frightened birds. People stumbled, and the crowd dissolved into a ring around the thing that had just shown itself. What followed changed the valley's map of what was possible. The horse did not run. It stepped with the gravity of a mountain and moved to stand between Mara and those who had tried to humiliate her. Its flank brushed the magistrate's knee, and the old man found his footing in its shadow, as if given a reason to remember his professional humility. No one shouted orders because there were none that mattered. The coterie of mockers looked at one another and found their bravado dissolved. Crispin, whose curiosity had been the sharpest blade of mockery, reached forward like a man wanting to prove he could understand magic, and his hand met the horse's flank. His face changed in a way words would not carry, pale and wide-eyed, a child suddenly understanding the magnitude of history. Mara dismounted with slow dignity and walked to the magistrate. She did not gloat. She did not open soft triumphs. She simply took the old man's hand and used the motion to help him reposition. The crowd watched the smallest of rituals, a soldier asking a magistrate to do what his craft had always required, bear witness. The magistrate coughed, and then cleared his throat like a man disturbed from a dream. He looked at Mara as if he were measuring the length of rope, and then, with the authority that used to feel like a blade, pronounced order. "This beast," he said, voice cracking into a tone that held more than the ordinary legalities, "is no creature to be claimed by scorn under his breath." And, as if admitting a truth to a ledger, he asked, "What is its name?" Mara looked at the horse, which bowed its head in a way that suggested a tired courtesy. No words came out of her in the way of ceremony. She touched the hair by its ear and then said simply, "Carith." The name slipped from her like a seal. No one in the crowd made claims. A breath of something like reverence moved through them all. The magistrate reached out and felt the horse's flank, and then looked at Mara like a man remembering another page from a book he had once read. He said nothing then, because sometimes the law cannot encapsulate what it sees. The horse had done what the Phantom Legion had been rumored to do, change the narrative. That night, the valley carried different stories. The coterie's mockery collapsed into a stunned silence that in some settled into a shame so thick it would take years to erosion. Haver, who had once been inflated by the small cruelties of less brave men, found himself small indeed. He wandered off with a loss like a bruise no salve could cure. Crispin, whose curiosity had driven him near the threshold, stayed and watched, eyes wide, for he had seen the world tilt and had been given a view of another kind of measure. Mara did not let the moment swell into an anthem. She had not come to be crowned. She had come to protect something that had been left by fate or fortune and required tending. She stayed the night under the oak, her back against the horse's flank, and Carith rested his head on her shoulder with the easy trust of an old companion. The horse's breath warmed her neck. The valley breathed around them like a living thing. For the next weeks, the magistrate did his job in good faith and with uncharacteristic fervor. He found records, some dust-eaten and some hidden in boxes meant to be thrown out, that connected Carith to a line that had been erased from polite histories. There were mentions of colossal beasts in the merchant logs, a line of riders called the Ironbridgers who had served in a campaign whose successes had been quietly whispered away. A stamped ledger revealed that House Oren had indeed owned such a beast once. The discovery put the magistrate in the uncomfortable place of being proven right to both those who feared the unknown and those who wanted to keep the old stories tidy. The presence of Carith in the valley changed the calculations of power. Merchants came with measurements and offers, governors with their own equations of prestige, and men with petitions that had the shape of bargains. Where merchants saw the opportunity to ship a creature like that for profit, Mara saw a duty not to fracture what had been entrusted to goodness. She knew, with the hard confidence of someone who had seen men broken and men made, that creatures such as Carith were not meant to be paraded as trophies nor farmed as beasts of burden in the sordid market that stripped dignity from living things. A man named Calder, a respectful authority figure who held the weight of the county militia like a man who had been given a template and meant to improve it, came to see what had stirred the valley into such a riot. He had the demeanor of a man who did not need to prove himself, but whose presence carried the nods of others. He watched Carith for an hour in silence, and then approached Mara. He was not the type to shower praise, but he had a soldier's eye for capability and a magistrate's heart for fairness. "You handled him well," Calder said, the phrase not so much a compliment as a recognition. "I have served with men less composed." He did not call her a soldier or a phantom. He called her simply by a name she had only grudgingly accepted from life. He asked about the notations hidden in the ledger and about Carith's markings. His questions were practical, like the ones a man asks when deciding whether a bridge is safe to cross. She was left to those who would keep her, Mara said. And for a moment the pronoun was feminine and correct because Carith had a presence that suggested a resonance more human than beast. Some men wanted to sell. Others wanted to parade. She did not permit the sentence to become an argument about morality. She offered it like a map. Calder nodded and offered her a position she did not ask for. A post that would keep her near Carith, a patch of authority and legitimacy that would be a buffer against the kinds of men who would reduce the horse to a prize. He would not grant titles. He had little use for pomp. He offered something that mattered more to Mara, the deed to a small field near the oak and the authority to keep Carith's well-being paramount. It was, she realized, the kind of validation that had been missing in the joke-laced valley since she had returned from battle. Not applause, but trust. There were skeptics. Some men in the magistrate's own office muttered about the cost of keeping such a behemoth alive. The militia wanted assurances that Carith would not become a roving hazard. Mara met their concerns with measured facts. She prepared budgets, drew up what a pasture would need, and arranged for local blacksmiths to fashion harnesses strong enough not to bruise Carith's skin. She taught a few willing young people to care for the horse, to know the difference between a lame limb and a tired one, to braid the mane with respect rather than mockery. A skeptic-turned-ally emerged in the form of Lisa, the skeptical apprentice of the magistrate who had once laughed at Mara in the square. Lisa had come to watch the spectacle and left with a mind reshaped. She had the honest incredulity that turned to human respect when she saw what Carith could do. Carry a cart across a flooded stretch where ordinary animals would have slipped and given the cart, in her quiet exertion, the kind of steadiness that made men fall silent. Lisa learned the difference between being amused and being humbled, and her hands, once only capable of carrying petitions and muttered complaints, learned to braid Carith's mane with a patient reverence. Not all men vanished into shame. The coterie of mockers splintered in consequence. Haver was sent away from the valley on a poorly concealed exile, assigned to a border post where his arrogance would be less contagious. Crispin, who had been nearest to understanding and whose curiosity had been the softest blade of the group, became a follower of sorts. Not a sycophant, but a man made honest by the sight of things he had to confess to. The magistrate kept his ledger tidy and added a line at the bottom about the responsibility the valley held to its past and to the creatures that crossed it. But the real change was quieter. People began to speak of Karith not as a beast, but as a presence that belonged to them in the way a lighthouse belongs to a coastline. They would stand at the edge of the field and watch how the horse's breath fogged in the cold, and how its eyes, saturnine pools, watched seasons like a calendar. Children, who once used giant creatures as fodder for their games, now left offerings of grass or hand-rolled oats. The story of the Maid of the Hollow shifted into a tale with a different ending. Not humiliation, but a stewardship that demanded something of the valley in return. Yet not all destiny bends itself to the reasonable. A rumor spread like a frayed wire. Documents in the capital mentioned colossal war beasts retired from campaigns of old and stored like secrets because nations feared what returned to them. There were men who wanted to harness such things for war. Men who saw value in the way Karith made the earth listen. They filed petitions, offered coin, and spoke the language of necessity. Mara answered not with fire, but with a slow, unyielding list of risks and protections. She invited the skeptical minds to watch Karith demonstrate restraint instead of raw power. There was a subtle pedagogy in how she presented the beast. It was not a weapon to be drawn on a whim. It was something that carried weight and thus needed careful hands. And then the final test came. Not for men who sought to buy or conquer, but from a night a ways off when the valley found itself faced with a flood that rose like a wall. Winter had broken and melted in a violent manner, and the river screamed with a ferocity that made the hills tremble. Houses near its banks took the first brunt, and barns, lightweight in the way of human plans, began to float, doors banging like the hands of lost people on their way to being submerged. When the alarm was raised, those long, alarming shouts that are the language of disasters, Mara grabbed her coat and moved like someone whose hands had always known the weight of urgency. Karith seemed to smell the water before the rest of the valley. He paced at the edge of the bluff, and the hair at his neck bristled like the ridge of an old map. Mara called to Lisa and Calder and the militia and said with the voice of one used to making decisions in the dark, "We will use him." There were those who argued about using a creature in danger. The magistrate, ever careful, asked whether the risk was necessary, and Mara met his gaze and gave him the kind of answer that needs no drama to mean everything. If we cross that river and lift the houses from the worst of the flood, that man will not die. She pointed toward a cluster of roofs already smudged by the rising water. We will not use him for war. We will use him for saving. Because sometimes beings give themselves to the world in ways that are neither property nor tool. Karith stood as they harnessed him. The harnesses, strong and respect-worn, took on the strain of plans. The valley watched. People stood on rooftops with one arm clinging and the other pointing like a compass. Those who had once mocked now offered ropes, blankets, and a quick, embarrassed mercy to be of use. Calder led a team and placed himself under the animal's flank as a man who understood where the line of responsibility lay. The magistrate carried papers no longer useful in the face of real life, and then set them down like dead leaves. The river met Karith, and he entered it like a god stepping into his domain. The water rose to his chest and beat like thunder against his sides. Where ordinary horses would have buckled, Karith anchored himself as if the river was being argued with and told to continue politely elsewhere. He took the sleds and broken carts and the ropes they had tied, and he moved with a patience that was not human, but not less honorable. He carried the living and the stunned and the shipper's few valuables in a steady rhythm that turned panic into an organized motion. Mara sat in the front of a makeshift harness, boots in the water, breath steady. She felt the animal's strength like a current and, more than that, an intelligence. He walked paths in the water they could not see, eddies and undercurrents that would have unmade lesser beasts. Once, while the river tried to twist and tear, Karith planted his hooves and made a path wherein men could follow. There were screams and prayers, and men thanking a beast between fear and awe. After the flood waned and the sun returned, layering the field with steam, the valley would say for years that it was Karith that saved them. The truth was less tidy. Karith could have done nothing without hands that respected the animal and men who would use it for mercy rather than conquest. Mara had made the choice to temper the fear of men into coordinated action, and in doing so she had revealed the most important lesson of a long life. The right use of power is not to humiliate or exploit, but to answer a call larger than the self. There were consequences that were both practical and subtle. Houses were lifted and slowly rebuilt. The valley's stores were less wealthy, but the people were alive to sweep the field and repair the walls. The magistrate wrote new ordinances about the care of large animals and made provisions to prevent their sale for war. House Oren, hearing of the heroic deeds, asked after the horse in tones that mixed guilt and avarice. Letters came asking to reclaim what had once been their prestige. Mara met the letters with the same measured restraint she had used in court. She answered not with defiance, but with the law and with the story of what Karith had been used for. The public opinion that had been the coteries' currency turned. People who had once mocked were now the first to bring water and strengthen fences. The valley kept Karith. Calder became a friend who could speak plainly and be listened to. Lisa took over the day-to-day matters and became a keeper of the horse and of the quiet rituals that the creature demanded. She learned the small math of feeding a mountain and the art of letting a beast speak through action. Mara, meanwhile, became something of a quiet mentor. Young people came to her with a shy reverence and asked questions about discipline and duty. She rarely gave speeches, but when she taught, she was direct and economical. How to balance harnesses, when to trust instincts, and how to refuse cruelty. She had become a living lesson to those who thought power was loud. The coterie, now splintered, found their reputations narrowed. Haver's exile turned into a slow erosion of influence. Crispin had a harder reformation. He spent long evenings helping mend fences and learning to braid manies. People told the tales differently than before. Where they would have once laughed about the Maid of the Hollow, they now told tales of a woman who had refused to be small because she had known the cost of being large in the wrong hands. Caritha's mane became a symbol of a stewardship that could confound men who sought the glory rather than the work. Years passed. Seasons left their marks on roofs and faces. Karith grew not only older, but more integrated into the valley's life. He gave the people what he could: labor in heavy times, a steady presence in sudden weather, and a modest beauty that had nothing to do with being tamed. Mara grew older, too, not in limpness, but in a kind of settled dignity. She refused medals and honors, things that felt like loans from a world that wanted to measure heroism in ribbons. Instead, she created a school for those who wanted to learn the art of stewardship, how to keep large things in the world and protect them from being crushed by greed. The school was small at first, a few earnest students with hands raw from work. It flourished because Mara knew that skill was not merely technical, but moral. She taught them to see the lines where care departed from exploitation. She recited the old rules of the Phantom Legion, when duty meant silence, and when silence meant complicity, and she added her own hard-won rules about consent and the responsibility of keeping a thing alive. Her lessons were not fanfare. They were precise, useful, and they made those who listened better people. In this way, Mara moved from being the hidden legend to the quiet mentor, a transition that was a natural extension of her life rather than a change of costume. The valley honored her, not by chiseling her likeness in a pompous stone, but by telling her story when children asked why the horse lived at the oak and not in a stable elsewhere. They told it in a simple way, with truth. She came when a giant was tied to a tree, and she chose to keep him. They added details only as a human thing does, older, gentler embellishments, not to alter the truth, but to make it a story that could be carried. Caritha's mane, once a source of mockery, became a relic of sorts, a symbol. It was not worshipped. It was braided with humility and left as a marker of stewardship. People tied small tokens into it, ribbons of blue and spears woven of straw, things that spoke not of conquest but of respect. When visitors asked what had happened that day in the square, they would be told the essential sequence: mockery, restraint, demonstration, and the choice to use power for good. It was a tidy narrative because people like tidy endings. The truth was a little messy, eh? There had been rage and storms and the rusted remains of men's arrogance. But in the end, those who had been cruel found their own lives narrower for their choices. Mara herself was unassuming until the end. She refused the trappings of greatness. She liked the rough work of hands and the steady company of Karith. When she finally grew tired, a slow fatigue that was not only age, but the accumulation of having sustained others, she sat by the oak and let the valley bring offerings. Calder and Lisa and a host of quiet faces came to her and wrapped their hand around her, not to lift her to a pedestal, but to remember the woman who had given a life to a horse and taught a valley what that gift meant. She died the way soldiers prefer, sudden in its peace, not extravagant. Karith stood by the oak and did not bow, because bowing had the wrong angle for such things. He lowered his head, and the world felt the absence of something essential. People came to mourn not a legend, but a person who had chosen a path in simple, day-to-day increments. There were no banners, no elaborate fanfare. Instead, there were hands that made a circle and stories that did not shout about triumph, but sang softly of resilience. After she died, the valley considered many ways to honor her. They raised no statue in bronze, for she had never liked the idea of being a thing pinned up for eyes only. They created instead a small center for stewardship, with a name simple as a sentence. Lisa ran it and taught as Mara had taught, balanced with the hard skill of tending beasts and the moral choices that came with it. The magistrate recorded things differently in his ledgers from then on, noting that sometimes law had to bow to the quiet and the deliberate. And Karith, old and enormous and otherworldly as ever, remained tied to the oak for the time his bones allowed. He lived long enough to see a number of children grow into people who would remember the day the Maid of the Hollow refused to be smaller than the story the coterie would have written. He gave the valley seasons and a constant presence that made the ordinary measure of days seem steadier. When people spoke of Mara, they used simple phrases. They did not make her a monument beyond what she had been. They called her the woman who understood that giants could be more than weapons, that they could be sanctuaries and helpers if men learned to carry themselves when great things moved among them. They told the story of the note in the horse's mane and of the line, "Do not free this beast unless you know the cost of letting giants walk loose among men." And they used it as a moral calculation, a lesson that required thinking beyond immediate gain. Generations later, in a valley changed by storms and the small kindnesses of people who had learned to steward life, children would still run to the oak and feel the thud of the earth where Karith had stood. They would add their own ribbons to a braid and ask the older ones if it was true that the horse had once been the property of a house that had coveted more than it could hold. The older ones would smile and say yes, and then tell how a woman came and would not let people make something small. The narrative, like a river, would change course and yet remain the same stream. In the warm corner of those stories, a plaintive question lingered and was often asked by those who lived after. What if she had decided differently? What if Mara had chosen to walk away when the horse was tied to the tree? The more practical people said she could have done many things and none of them would have been heroism. The sentimental said the valley would have been poorer. But what mattered most, and what the valley remembered best, was not the drama of the choice, but the character by which the choice was made. Mara's life had been a collection of small, steady refusals to be defined by other people's laughter. She had chosen labor over spectacle. She had chosen a life of tending. When the last of Karith's days came, when the seasons had finished with him and his great heart slowed like a drum run down, the village did not stockpile grief. They gathered and sang not about destiny, but about care. Mara's name, in the end, was less a headline and more a lesson. The ribbons in Karith's mane grew thick with the years, a tapestry of different lives, all tied into one larger story. The note, if it remained anywhere, had been preserved in a small, unremarkable book of deeds in the magistrate's safe. People read it and made a face and understood the weight of its words anew. There are myths that claim giants roam free and wreck cities, and there are other myths that claim giants can do good when handled with hands at no restraint. Mara's story became the latter, a quiet myth for people who preferred hard facts wrapped in small human decency. In the valley, the lesson wasn't that the Maid of the Hollow became a ruler or that her name was etched into marble. It was that an underdog, quiet, unassuming, and underestimated, could, with a single act of resolve, turn mockery into purpose and, in doing so, shape the destiny of a place for better uses. They insisted that she had been vindicated, that the coteries' laughter had been replaced by gratitude, and that House Oren's claims had been redrawn into a narrative of restitution, because the law now required honesty. They argued about the metaphors and the details. But on clear nights, when the wind carried the sound of distant roads, those who had been young the day the horse was tied would look at the silhouette of the oak and feel a small, steady peace. They would remember a woman who did not shout, and a horse that did not rear, and a valley that learned how to tether itself to better values. It was the quietness that proved most compelling. Mara had been an unremarkable woman to those who had no need for her talents in earlier days. When she acted, she did so by choosing the difficult path, to use dignity against derision, to prefer the long work of stewardship to the short thrill of proving someone wrong. She did not become a legend by seeking it. She became one by refusing to be small and by refusing to let a giant be cruel. In the end, the note that had hung in Caritha's mane was curled and yellow with age and kept in the ledger the magistrate had written. A child once asked Lisa why they kept a scrap of paper so carefully. "Because some rules need memory," Lisa answered. "Because we will need to remember the cost and how we chose not to pay it in cruelty." That was tribute enough. Not the grandest of all tributes, but a practical one, a small blue cloth in a field, a center for stewardship, and stories told not to declare someone a hero, but to offer a shape for how to be human. The underdog had been vindicated, not by spectacle or by a parade on the main road, but by the steady act of daily care and the creation of a legacy that made the valley safer for those who came after. They told the story again and again in the afternoons when shadows lengthened and the children were slow and the work was almost done. The tone was never triumphalist. It was instead a simple and steady recounting, like those who teach apprentices the balance of a tool. Hold here, not there. Do this because it is right. And when asked, as children often asked, whether Mara had been afraid, the elders would look at the oak and say, "She was a veteran. Fear taught her to listen."